Welcome to this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about important considerations when recruiting international board members. And joining me is Francisco Lorca, who's a board member with MoneyGram International. Welcome, Francisco.
Hi, TK. Thank you for having me on this show.
So I think maybe a good place for us to start, since this world is becoming such a small place as far as companies expanding all over the world, I think a good place for us to start would be maybe you could go through the process that you went through as an international director when you were recruited onto the MoneyGram International Board, which happens to be headquartered in Dallas. And I believe at the time you were in London.
That's correct. So yes, I live, my main home is in London, although I spend a lot of time flying back and forward. And I also have another home in Spain. And my process was pretty unique because it happened we started in September 2020, and I came on board March 2021. So everything was done during COVID, during the height of COVID, and it was all locked down. So I literally used the same computer when I was doing all the process. But maybe let me take one step back and tell a little bit of what MoneyGram was, and what made them bring me on board. So MoneyGram at that point was in a stage in which it was changing its course. It was going more digital. It was changing its business to a faster growth and to move focus from the physical world to a digital world. And also it was becoming even more global. So that made the board think that it was a good time to renew their board, to bring new blood to it. And they decided to bring 3 new board members. In my case, what they were looking for were 3 things. They were looking for a different point of view in the sense of somebody that did business outside the US. So this is where the international part comes from it. And I like to say it's different to be international or foreign than being international and global. So in my case, it's more global. I've done business I built my company, for example, the company that I run right now in India. I lived in China for a while. I've also lived in 3 or 4 countries in Europe. And in all of them, I built business from the beginning. So that, I think, made them see that I could bring a diverse point of view, a different point of view to the board that was very needed for them as they were growing the business. So that was one of the factors that we're looking at. The second factor was somebody that could bridge the established company, the corporate company, with a startup, with a different mindset. And I've done a little bit of both. I was in McKinsey for a number of years, in GE, in First Data, but I've also set up my own business, which, for example, I still run. I sold a company to Telefonica a long time ago. So I know how both worlds work, and I think I can be a good bridge at it. So that was also some of the things that they were looking at as the business was changing. And the third one was also payments and fintech, which is where I spent half of my life. In terms of how the process worked, I did know the process did not work through a headhunter. It was MoneyGram that came directly through me. The chairman of the board reached out to me. And the background of that was a long time ago, about 20 years ago, when I was working in First Data, I worked with some of the members of the executive team in MoneyGram. So they knew of me. I hadn't seen them in a long time, but they kind of knew what I was doing. And 6-7 years ago, I saw a fintech company that I was invested in that I thought would be interesting to MoneyGram. I put them in touch, and that sparked MoneyGram and the board of MoneyGram remembering my name. From a pure process, what it was is, as I said, the chairman reached out to me. I had a couple of interviews with a non-committee, with the 3 members of a non-committee, all virtual, all in a camera. I met a couple of people from the executive team. And then in about 5-6 months, I actually joined that board. Again, everything was virtual. My first onboarding was also virtual because I couldn't fly. My first 3 board meetings were actually virtual. And it was interesting because in the beginning, we were all virtual, and that was fine. We had little boxes for all the board members, and that was okay. What was a little bit harder was my second and third board meeting. people were going back to being normal, I couldn't fly to the US. Foreigners were not allowed, Europeans were not allowed in the US until December. So my first public board, my first board meetings with MoneyGram I was the only one on a screen. So that made it a little bit more challenging. On the other hand, I was very lucky because then when we went physical, I decided to spend more time for each board meeting. I decided to spend a couple of days before each board meeting, just being in the offices and meeting the team. And that made a big difference. So it was a very fascinating process. I've been very, very lucky the way that how the board was already made up and how welcoming and how eager they were to welcome me and the other two board members to the team. It had its challenges, but I don't think the challenges were not because I was away. They were basically created by COVID more than me being away.
So your experience was a little unique, but I want to tap your experience from the sense of what thought process should boards go through prior to recruiting an international director who resides outside the U.S.? And then a follow-up question to that, is that the same for a Europe or Asian company that's seeking to have an American residing director?
That's a very good question, both of them. So the first one, I would always ask, if I am in the non-committee, but we were bringing somebody that was not a resident in the US, I would ask myself three questions. Very simple. First one is why? Why do you want to bring somebody that's international? And I would say, well, again, same difference. It's different if you want somebody that has a specific knowledge of one market. Say that your company wants to enter Austria and you want somebody that opens doors there. That's fine. You want somebody specific on that. For me, the why that becomes more attractive is when you say, I want somebody that's global because they're going to help us think global. Or even if we're not going global, if that person thinks global, they're going to bring a good challenge. They're going to bring a diverse point of view to my board. So that would be the first one. Really understand why you want that person. If it's just one specific market or if it's just somebody that's going to enrich your board culture and the speech on the board. The second part would be who. What kind of person do you bring over? Obviously, you need to do your assessment of whether the person is board ready. You cannot lower those standards by saying I'm going to bring somebody that's very global. They're going to give me experience in Asia. They're not ready to be on the board, but we'll help them. I think you need to have that standard at the same level. But from a global perspective, I would just say, do they really also know how to work in the US? I would not bring a person that's a superstar in 8 markets. They know they've been on a board. There's an ex-CEO, but they've never done business in the US. They've never spoken. They've never had interaction with leaders in the US company. Because what's going to happen there is that even if that person speaks the language perfect, you're going to need translators. And I mean translators, like people are going to have to explain to you the difference in culture. And they're not going to be able to add to your board. They're going to go. They might even be dysfunctional because they're going to be semi-isolated. So make sure that person knows what it is to work in the US. The other point that I would take, the other 2 points in terms of who do you bring on board. One is make sure that they're independent thinkers. And what I mean by that is if you bring somebody that's a board member in another market, in the UK, in Germany, in Spain, for example, the way that you act on a board on those countries, it's very different than in the US. It's much more subtle. People don't disagree that openly. Things happen a little bit in a less open way than in the US. So you want somebody, don't just say they're US board ready because they've been on a board of a public company outside. Make sure that they're going to be independent. By definition, global people are, if it's somebody that's worked in many countries, they're going to be more energetic, more independent. But don't just say they've been on a board, therefore they're not going to know what it is to be independent. And then the last one on the who is, do they have the time? Like in any board in the US, do you have the time? Plus, I would add at least 1 or 2 days per board meeting. Are they going to have the time to come over? Don't come the night before and be jet lagged. They actually stay around, know what's going on, get our best so that they can actually be functional. And if it's remote, do they have the time and do they feel comfortable starting their board meeting close to midnight their time if they're in Asia? So those are more logistic questions, but they're important. And then the last question that I would ask myself is, how do you bring them on board? The first thing is beware that when you ask for references in other markets other than in the US, when you ask other board members or you ask professionals, the way that people give feedback about some of their old colleagues, it's much less open than in the US. So you're always going to get very proper, very polite, very elegant questions in Europe, in Asia, but sometimes it's harder to dig deep on the actual value of a board member. So you want to be able to ask questions or find people that are going to be very open to you. Otherwise, outside the US, normally people are much more subtle if they don't want to recommend somebody. It's a little bit different. Spend time with them before you bring them on board. Don't do the typical fly in on at 10 a.m. You meet the whole board, have lunch, and then we decide if we like you or we don't like you. Do at least one dinner or two dinners with a board member because again, jet lag, they're going to be different personality. Get to know them a little bit better. And then the last thing on the how is something that worked very well for me in MoneyGram, which was not by design, but actually happened because all my colleagues on the board are awesome, but two of them were incredibly good on that. They became my mentors. They just became my mentors. And in a way, they were doing two things. They were teaching me what it is to be on my first public board, but they were also helping me as a foreign board member, as a global board member, to make myself more effective. That was very, very, very positive. In terms of your second question, in the US, I would just turn around one of those components. All those questions apply with the exception of the independent part. I would turn around the independent thing is if I'm outside the US and I want to bring a US board member, I would say that foreign board needs to be ready to bring an independent director. So a lot of boards act in a way that's much less subtle than in the US. If you're going to bring a US board member, they're going to be used to speak more openly. So is your company ready for that? Is your board ready for that?
We both know that the world is becoming a smaller, more global space. And it's a fact that more and more boards are going to be looking for whether it's an international or, as you say, global director. And Francisco, I want to thank you for taking the time. The advice has been just super here. So I appreciate you taking the time and joining us to cover this important topic.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligent Institute's Inside Today's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.